These mountains hold numberless secrets that reward us when we unlock them with joy and astonishment. Clues are found everywhere within their beautiful rugged cliffs and peaceful valleys that lead us to unlocking these secrets. We revealed a history of over 100 forests that were entombed and petrified. We uncovered the amazing events that occurred where the beautiful Yellowstone Lake is. We learned the dark history that led to the formation of massive amounts of this beautiful rock. And surprisingly, we come to understand why the centers of ancient volcanoes are where large numbers of grizzly bears congregate. This is the second video of a two-part series. Although not necessary, I recommend watching part 1 before this video.
The beautiful Yellowstone Lake. It's a bit windy here today, a bit cool. Now the waves crashing in. I've been here, countless times, so many times, but it never gets old. I have so many good memories here at Yellowstone Lake and other places within the park. It's just a wonderful place to be. But there's something about this lake I want to tell you about. Right behind me, out in the distance, was a big stratovolcano. Yeah, a big stratovolcano. And I know that there's some of you will be saying, well, yeah, of course, there's the big caldera of Yellowstone. No, this was a much older volcano. You know, it was some 45 million years old or so. And then the big hot spot moved in, right? And about 630,000 years ago, it obliterated. When that supervolcano came in, it obliterated the mountain. The stratovolcano out here completely obliterated it. Amazing, amazing stuff. I hope you're wondering to yourself, well, that is super cool, awesome. But I want you to wonder, well, how did geologists know that? How can you know something that existed that's no longer there? And as we go forward and learn more about these volcanic deposits and stratovolcanoes and how they work, you'll know why. It'll become pretty darn clear.
It turns out that building knowledge on these volcanoes also unlocks the secret of the grizzlies and other amazing treasures we find, like petrified trees. This is going to be a fun journey. Let's start this adventure by looking at some fascinating outcrops not too far from Yellowstone National Park along Highway 14.
Beautiful outcrop here. Now, we've already seen examples of what I call mega Lahars, these mud flows with gigantic blocks in them in the mountainside. But this is what's more typical here on these Absaroka volcanoes. Lots of beautiful clasts encased in mud. Now, if we look at the contact here at the bottom, it came in over a tuffaceous sandstone, this Lahar did, and notice that these clasts here are smaller at the bottom. And as you go up, they get bigger and bigger. And then there's some complications at the top. But this is very typical of Lahars. It's referred to as inverse grading, where the grading of the clast size is the reverse of what you would expect, like in river deposits.
Looking at the outcrop, you can see several Lahars. They're typically about 4 to 5 feet thick. It's not uncommon to find Lahars containing a mix of beautifully colored volcanic rock. So many different types of volcanic rock jumbled into this Lahar, each with their own story. As an example, this very large red rock broke off the volcano and was transported within a Lahar down the mountain to here. The red color comes from the oxidation of iron, which likely occurred as a result of large volumes of steam filtering through the rock. Sometimes it's easy to become mesmerized by the beauty of these deposits and forget the utter devastation they cause. We'll learn more about this area in a minute.
Now, another thing I want to point out that's pretty darn interesting is it's poorly sorted. Although there's a general tendency for small class at the bottom to larger at the top. It doesn't always occur that way, by the way. But if you come up here where the larger clasts are, I can find tiny little clasts that are like the size of a BB or something, very small. And then down in here, you can find the larger class. So they tend to be poorly sorted. Not surprising when you think of all these clasts, these rocks and broken up volcanic fragments floating in mud. And yet another thing I want to point out is the clasts in here can be very angular. The angles on the edges can be sharp and they have 90-degree angles, etc. They just don't look like they're very eroded. There are clasts in here also that are pretty rounded, like this one that I put my hand on here. This particular lahar has a mix of angular clasts and ones that are smoother. Now I've got a question for you to think about. I love to do this, as you know. Why would you have some lahars that have pretty much all angular clasts and others that have very well-rounded clasts? Can you think of why? Now it turns out these types of deposits, these lahars, are volumetrically very significant here in the Absarokas, in these strata volcanoes, and they are elsewhere as well, but they seem particularly abundant here. We're going to see a lot more of these and get a feel for how important they really are.
As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of lahars associated with the Sunlight Volcano. Let me show you what I mean. Can you still see me? Impressive, isn't it? These two light-colored areas are intrusions of dacite, a rock composed primarily of plagioclase and quartz. The erosional features within these deposits sure are interesting. I wonder how many individual lahar flows occurred to build up this accumulation. I'm just a tiny dot right here. An impressive mountain, isn't it? But it turns out there is more than this to see. A whole lot more. I'm right here, but too small to see, and this relatively thin sequence is what we've been focusing on. There's an entire mountain above it of lahar deposits. Unbelievable. This is hard to take in, isn't it? Especially when you consider the tremendous amount of erosion that has occurred. In fact, if we could see the uneroded volcano in the distance poking up through the clouds, it would be 3 times taller than what we observe here. Furthermore, lahars can be traced 30 miles from the center of this ancient volcano named the Sunlight Volcano. For a devastating example of modern lahar deposition that occurred in 1996 and 97, we can go to the island of Montserrat in the West Indies. This volcano is much smaller, about 1/5 the size of the ancient Sunlight Volcano. You can clearly see where large volumes of lahars mixed with pyroclastic flows occurred. Pyroclastic flows are clouds of hot gas mixed with volcanic material that flow rapidly along the ground. Although there are some deposits on the steep sides of the volcano, the vast majority of deposition occurred on the lower and distal slopes. The capital city of Plymouth, located in this area, with about 4,000 residents, was completely destroyed and 19 people lost their lives. Here it's quite clear that the lahars have built a relatively thick fan-shaped accumulation of mud and rocks with no evidence of them on the steeper slopes of the volcano. As we see on Google Earth, the lahars flowed clear down to the ocean 3 miles here and 4 miles here. These lahars carried many volcanic rocks within them of various sizes. Notice the very large ones behind the buildings. And of course, the destruction is just heartbreaking. This relatively small volcano that only rises about 2,900 feet above sea level sure caused a lot of destruction. Returning to the mountains of Lahars on the flanks of the 48-million-year-old Sunlight Volcano, I try to visualize the seemingly numberless catastrophic volcano eruptions and lahar flows that devastated animal and plant life. With the background we now have, this double window is even more interesting, and it's so beautiful at multiple levels. I think you can understand me when I say I could spend hours investigating and contemplating the marvelous history written in these rocks. It's time to visit one of my favorite areas of the Absaroka Mountains, the northern regions of Yellowstone National Park. This lava flow with its columnar joining is astoundingly beautiful, and it's part of the Absaroka complex, not the Yellowstone supervolcano. The high grasslands and open spaces are typical of the Absarokas here. It's critical habitat for bison, elk, and other animals. I've come to these highlands to explore an area I've never been to, and I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I finally made it to where I want to be and to show you what I want to show you. What a tricky place to get to, and it's quite a hike. I mean, it's steep, and I ended up overshooting. I went up another 400 feet, clear to the top of the mountain, more than I needed to. I don't need to do that. It's a killer hike, at least for me already. I got up there and I thought, oh boy, I had some general ideas where to go, but specifically no. And I thought, I'm just going to call my friend Shawn Willsey. He knows where it is. And he has his own Geology YouTube channel, really nice channel. If you really want to learn more geology, check him out. But he helped me out, and here I am. Let me show you. So here we go. Wonderful, beautiful, love it. This is sure a big petrified tree. Wow. It's certainly making an impression on me. I've never been here before. I've wanted to come here many, many years ago. I learned about them, and finally I make it. A magical place, really impressive. As I hiked over to here and saw these upright trees, these petrified trees, boy, it caught my imagination, and immediately my mind was going to, what have these things witnessed? These trees, these poor trees. These were able to survive upright. You know, they didn't get pushed over like so many. But don't you wish you could just see what these trees witnessed? The great strata volcanoes erupting, ash clouds, lahars coming their way, unfortunately, eventually covering them and killing all these forests off. And speaking of forests, it turns out on this mountainside, they've identified 27 different layers, one on top of another, of these petrified trees. So we know there were at least that many forests, healthy forests, that grew, were destroyed, and a new cycle started. And it turns out there are many of these petrified forests scattered all throughout the Absarokas. I know of at least 10 or even more of these forests. And there are a lot of others, just individual trees or small pockets of them scattered all through this volcanic complex. Just really amazing. As I put my hand on this petrified tree, I can't help but think of everything that it's witnessed, the full geologic history, and to be covered for millions and millions of years, and relatively recently to see the light of day again. That's a lot to think about.
These lahar deposits are direct evidence of the catastrophe that these stately trees faced. At one time they were completely enveloped by this rock, which has now been eroded away to reveal their enduring beauty. In 1898, John Muir, considered by many to be the father of our national park system, visited this fossil forest and wrote in part, "Beneath living trees, the edges of petrified forests are exposed to view, standing on ledges tier above tier where they grew. Solemnly silent in rigid crystalline beauty after swaying in the wind thousands of centuries ago, opening marvelous views back into the years and climates and life of the past time." Exploring the area, I found many petrified logs and stumps at various levels. All the ones I saw were encased in lahar deposits like this large tree on its side. All of them have been replaced by silica, and most of them had amazing details preserved. Growth rings were easily visible and beautiful to behold. Even the cell structure has been petrified. Geologists can cut and polish rock into very thin slices and examine it under a microscope, and in the case of these silicified trees, they are beautiful to behold. Not surprisingly, each wood has a characteristic look and therefore easily identified. Some of the trees recognized include redwood, pine, sycamore, and oak. The magnificent specimen we saw earlier is a redwood. Here's a map showing the locations of 9 of the major fossil forests in the Absaroka volcanic field, and there are many, many more less significant localities. Keep in mind that most forests have multiple levels. For instance, the locality we visited has 27. This one has at least 31 levels, and this one has 48. I imagine that there are at least a couple hundred of individual fossilized forests within the Absarokas. Incredible, isn't it?
You know, when I saw this outcrop in the distance, I thought, I know what that is. You know, this thick section of light-colored rock. And I know you know what it was too, just from the distance. Because we've become familiar with what volcanic ash looks like. It's a light color, and we're in a volcanic province, so surely it's volcanic ash.
So the evidence indicates that this volcanic ash was reworked by a river system. Geologists refer to it as a fluvial tuff. How far away from the volcano do you think these sediments were deposited? Note that these tuff deposits sit on top of the trachyandesite lava flows that we were introduced to in the prior video. It's a great marker bed. In the distance you can see the full thickness of these deposits, which is about 200 feet. And it carries on down the mountain for some distance. I was able to trace this tuff deposit over an area of at least 15 by 25 miles. 200 feet of reworked ash. That's amazing to think about. Let's go to the top of this mountain to make some observations. Here I am walking along the edge. These are some tall cliffs, and the rock looks so different from anything that we've seen. In the flat area at the very base of this section, we see hints of the fluvial tuff that we are familiar with. I think we can divide this cliff into 2 basic parts. The lower half or so seems to be moderately organized. I see some evidence of layering, but not a lot, whereas the upper part looks to be highly organized with lots of layering clearly visible. The upper organized deposits have a tendency to weather into beautiful spires and walls. A closer examination of these deposits indicate that they have a mix of tuff, lake, and mud-rich lahar deposits, all indicating deposition far away from the volcano. I was able to see at least part of the lower section in a different part of the mountain, and what I saw was rather surprising. We see our trachyandesite lava flows, and then above that our fluvial tuff covered by rocks and grasses and weathering into a hummocky terrain. And then there's the interesting spires, which correlates to the lower part of the great cliff we just visited.
Are you ready to have some geologic fun? It's always fun to try to think about the processes that fit the observations that you make. And here is a very interesting observation to be made. We have the ash deposits, the tuff, reworked tuff deposits, go from the basalt below, working its way up, all the way up to very near or maybe even at the base of those big spires. And those spires are made of very coarse grained material in lahars and river gravels, big cobbles and boulders within that. And those are high energy deposits. When I say high energy, I mean it takes a lot of energy to move these big cobbles and boulders. And they came in right over very low energy tuff deposits. So a massive change here in environments of deposition, from low energy ash material, reworked ash, to high energy. How did that happen? Why did it happen? I'll give you some time to think about that one.
To summarize, we have a thick section of low energy, fine-grained fluvial tuff, then a fascinating sequence of lahars and river cobbles that we just visited, and then the upper organized sequence of mostly low-energy distal deposits. Very interesting and quite a puzzle to think about.
Time for the whiteboard discussion. Now, I've sketched a rather simple stratovolcano here, but I do want to point out the ground level that it built upon, which would be this heavy green line. So underneath it are, in this case, sedimentary rocks, and the volcanic pile, we often call it a volcanic pile of material building on top. I do want to say that this would be more of the proximal area to the cone, to the actual center, the medial, and then the distal. We've looked at lahars. In the modern analog of the Montserrat, the island of Montserrat, we saw that the lahars tended to stay on the lower slopes and potentially distal. And we've seen in the field for the Sunlight Volcano and in the Absarokas that the lahars can get quite distal. But they're not going to hang on these steep slopes because they're fluid, they're mud. They can be pretty thick, but they're not going to stay on these steep slopes. And also we saw in the field these river deposits and layered lake deposits and distal lahars. They're all way out here distal. They're also, for the most part, very fine grained. So there's this basic principle which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. On the steeper areas, you tend to see bigger clasts, big boulders and cobbles and things. And as you get out further and further, you're going to see more and more fine material. Until you get way distal, it can be very fine, like we saw on this fluvial tuff. Coming back to the tuff, an airfall ash, in theory, could be everywhere, right? But on the steeper slopes, it's going to be washed away by rain very quickly. So again, the tuffs tend to be medial to distal, the actual tuff deposits that are preserved.
To learn what types of deposits dominate the steep slopes of a stratovolcano, we can go to Mount St. Helens' southern slopes. This series of obvious flow deposits are not lahars, but thick, viscous, silica-rich flows called andesite lava. They are so thick they don't flow very far and tend to stop on relatively steep slopes.
A while back, I asked you to think about why you would have some lahars with very angular, sharp-edged clasts versus the rounded clasts. Let's think about that a minute. And we think about the system. I try to visualize what's going on volcanoes or around the areas of volcanoes. And of course, you're going to have natural rivers, just normal rivers coming off these big, high volcanoes like we have in the Absarokas. And those rivers, as you know, you get out along rivers that have these beautiful cobbles and boulders and everything in them, these mountain rivers, they're all rounded. The rivers round those very quickly. So we have rivers that have these rounded cobbles. And the lahars coming off the volcano, of course, are going to cross rivers. Maybe they're going to go right down along the river valley and pick up all these rounded cobbles. So that explains the rounded cobbles. And the angular cobbles are just come from the breaking up of the rock as the volcano explodes and swells and breaks and all that you've seen in videos of volcanoes. The rock is freshly broken, and it's entrained in the mud and comes down, hence the very angular class. Before we solve some puzzles, there's one last point I want to make. We need to think of things through time. So these volcanoes, if you think about it through time, they build up, they start small and get bigger and bigger, and then eventually they die out. But so I've sketched this one. He's pretty big, but through time, of course, it can get taller and taller, and more deposits coming out and building up proximally, medially, and distally, all these deposits. And that's why we have such massively thick Lahar deposits in the case of the Sunlight Volcano. It's just built up tremendous layers of Lahars. For me, this is the very funnest part, is to think about the puzzles, how to sort things out, the observations we make. And you have to think about the whole system. And in this case, if you'll recall, the puzzle that I brought up is that way out here distally, where we have these fluvially reworked ash deposits, the fluvial tuff, way out here, 200 feet. And then what was right on top of that? These large boulders and clasts, a thick section, it was probably about 200 feet as well, sitting on top of these deposits, just like that. The world changed. Let me at least put a vertical line here to represent that. I won't show everything yet. So 200 feet out here of these high energy, I like to use that word, high energy deposits over these low energy deposits. How could that possibly happen? Well, let me give you a clue. This is a volcanic system. There's more than one volcano. We've just sketched the one. So you have to think about the whole Absaroka system, the complex. Let's put a volcano in our mind out here, over here. And not only that, they don't all go at the same time, do they? They work around. And in fact, in this case, the old ones were in the north, and they progressively got younger as you go to the south. And then it's not just north-south, it's east-west. So you've got to think all these things through. But to keep it simple, let's put a volcano over here. Now it has its own deposits, and it has its own high energy deposits. And lo and behold, that's how you can do that. Have a volcano here, and it has these high energy lahars and rivers with the big cobbles and stuff, and they're coming out this way from this volcano over here, depositing out, and their distal deposits, I should put some out here, would be out here. Onlapping, we call it, onlapping the prior deposits of this volcano. And sometimes they can be going at the same time. And in that case, they fill in together and meet in the middle out here and interfinger with each other. And it's really fun if you see that in outcrop, which I have. I've seen that at times. So that's really interesting, isn't it? That's how we do that. And then if you really want to think about it, you go, well, wait a minute, we could have a volcano off in the distance over here, and it could bring in deposits from that direction, etc., and build an overlap. Geologists sorted this all out, and they noticed that they could group several volcanoes to the north, the very oldest ones. It turns out that the northern volcanoes are the oldest, and they progressively get younger as you come to the south. And they took those volcanoes to the north and grouped them to the Washburn group. They grouped all the layers, all the different volcanic deposits, and that's from Mount Washburn in Yellowstone. And those being the oldest. Then this I've sketched here is kind of diagrammatically the Sunlight group, and it involves a few volcanoes as well, and it's a bit younger. So these deposits went out on top of and interfingered with the older ones to the north. And so those we'll call the middle group. And then to the southern, we have the thoroughfare group. And they're the very youngest. And so they went out on top of these. So you kind of have all these different overlapping relationships that are fun to think about. And it makes you think about certain situations, for instance, like the petrified trees. So the petrified trees that we visited, they were all in the Washburn group, the very oldest group. And there were 27 layers, at least in just that one mountainside. And there are others that could be even younger. They're all part of several volcanoes. They're the oldest, as I mentioned. And then as you come to the Sunlight group, they have petrified trees as well. And they're out on top of those because they're younger. And I'll sketch them on this side. I don't have the north side diagrammatically sketched. I don't have enough room. But I'll put vertical dark lines here, all these layers of petrified trees, many, easily 50 that we know about, and I'm sure there are way more than that, stacked up in this group. And then you have the thoroughfare group, and they have their own set of petrified forests scattered throughout that region. And so they're over here and on these volcanic deposits that came out on top of here. And so if you just in your mind think about this, there's, we'll say 100 layers or so of forests stacked up within the Washburn group if you sorted it all out. And easily that in the Sunlight group, and then the thoroughfare group. And you get the picture? There are hundreds of layers of these petrified forests in this Absaroka complex. That's fun to think about, isn't it? I think we now have enough knowledge to crack the code. Yeah, to crack the code as to how we know that there was a strata volcano where Yellowstone Lake now resides. And the fun one. Why is it that grizzlies go around and sniffing out, so to speak, and finding the very cores of these stratovolcanoes? Now that's pretty interesting.
With the knowledge of the expected distribution of various types of volcanic deposits and features, geologists have been able to identify at least 12 major stratovolcanoes within the Absaroka Range, as shown by the red dots on this map. They range in ages from about 50.6 million years old in the north down to 43.7 million years or so to the south. What an incredible complex this truly was. With the knowledge we now have, I think we can understand how geologists arrived at the conclusion that there was a volcano here. As geologists studied the rocks of this region, they found deposits that are medial to distal from an unknown volcano to the west. Coupled with the knowledge of the location of the Yellowstone caldera, it became clear that this unseen stratovolcano had been destroyed by the supervolcano. Wow! A similar process occurred at Mount Washburn, the location of another stratovolcano. They found lahars and lava flows sloping to the north, but they couldn't find any sloping to the south. It became clear that the supervolcano had destroyed the southern half of the Mount Washburn stratovolcano. So what is it with grizzlies seeking out volcanoes? It's rather surprising to see so many grizzlies in the high country. Over 100 grizzlies were identified in a recent flight over the region. This group is making its way across some large, steeply dipping lava flows, which are an important clue to this mystery. This is typical terrain that they congregate in. These big boys are making their way down a very steep talus slope. This one's decided he wants to take an afternoon nap. You'd think he could find a softer bed. It seems that everywhere you look, you see grizzlies. How many do you see here? A closer view reveals that there are 8 of them. What do you notice about the terrain from a geological perspective? Do you think we're close to the center of a volcano or further away? I haven't seen any lahars here at all, but I have seen lava flows like along this area, and we also saw them with the bears climbing around on them. This geology reminds me of what we saw in the first video in the core of the Sunlight volcano. As we've learned, the core area is dominated by lava flows, and these lava rocks are very brittle and prone to fracturing and frost wedging, which leads to the formation of large talus piles of distinctive angular pieces of rock. Watching these bears on the talus slopes, one clearly sees that they are digging within them for something. Even the young ones get in on it. This is what they're after. Yes, moths, the common miller moth, also known as the army cutworm moth. During midsummer, they migrate from the Great Plains up to the high Rocky Mountains seeking talus slopes. They spend their days in air pockets among the rocks, and at night they feed on the nectar of alpine plants. It's a lot of work for these bears to come up into the high country, and it's a time when they are building up their fat reserves. Surprisingly, moths provide the calories they are looking for. It's hard to believe, but a bear can consume up to 40,000 or even more moths per day. It's pretty fun to think about. Grizzly bears can find stratovolcanoes. I'm sure that many of you that are familiar with stratovolcanoes are asking the question, how is it that there are stratovolcanoes so far from the west coast? In fact, the Absaroka stratovolcanoes are about 700 miles away from the coast. This is much different than the stratovolcanoes we see elsewhere in the world. As an example, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, and the other stratovolcanoes scattered along the west coast are typically just over 100 miles from the coast. How can that be?
A sketch of the standard subduction zone that we're all familiar with, where we have an oceanic plate here diving underneath, the crustal plate here going down, 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 as of course as it gets deeper and deeper. It also tends to be quite hydrous with that water involved. The melting occurs that comes up and eventually forms a classic stratovolcano like we see on the west coast. So the second scenario that I've sketched up here, which is far more unusual, I've zoomed out here, so the distance from the coastline to the volcano is again like 700 miles, way inboard here. And I've put in blue the oceanic crust. So instead of immediately starting to dive under and subduct under the continental plate, it rides along underneath for some distance, a great distance here, before it finally starts to turn down and subduct. And of course, similar processes occur here as they did over here, where you get the melting, etc., and create these distinctive stratovolcanoes. Now, there are some debates about some of the processes occurring here and the reasons, etc., but that's beyond my area of expertise.
The Absarokas hold so many secrets. As an example, this entire mountain slid out as part of a gigantic landslide at speeds of over 100 miles per hour. You can learn about it on a previous video I did. These ancient volcanoes are critically important for lots of wildlife, like bighorn sheep, elk, and surprisingly, pronghorn antelope graze their high plateaus. It's amazing to think that from profound destruction that occurred, we now have such beauty to enjoy. Sometimes I think this is a metaphor for life. We pass through seemingly impossible trials, yet with time, new beauty and enjoyment can come into our lives.
I can never get over how amazing the history of this planet is. I feel so privileged to be able to go out, look at the rocks, and read the history written within them. And I've especially enjoyed making this video, and I hope you've enjoyed watching it. Thank you.